Thank you. It's great to be back here. We had a terrific time last time when we were talking about our first book, Game Changers, and we really want to thank Professor Leonhardt also, because not only did we tell you about what we were working on, she provided some valuable guidance early on as we were starting to do our research and pointed us in some of the right directions. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to do a tag team. Susie's going to start off and talk a little bit about some of the older history, going right after the gold rush, and then I'll sort of bring it up forward. And one of the things, just in passing, to note is that, as Susie will say, from our original research, we found that there are so many women who made significant contributions, but they're lost in history. And we wanted to bring that alive and fit some of their stories into an historical narrative. So, Susie, just start.
Oops, sorry.
And I'm going to work the machine here.
As Steve said, after we finished Game Changers, we realized that we had written an entire book about California's landmark elections, but there was scant mention of women. Really what we had talked about mainly was white men and their impact on California history. Now, we knew instinctively there had to be a number of women who had played key roles in the development of California. And we set out to find their stories and to relate them to people. This fall, we'll be releasing our new book, Paving the Way, and it tells the stories of these unknown and forgotten women who should be recognized for their amazing contributions. So let's start at the beginning, just after the gold rush. At that time, women weren't agitating for the vote. What they were most interested in was clothing reform. They were very interested in being able to wear the more comfortable bloomers as opposed to the very restrictive Victorian dresses. And they also were interested in spiritualism, as well as temperance. And women would hop on horseback, and they travel from one mining camp to another to talk to the hard-drinking, hard-driving men about the evils of liquor. Now, they attracted a lot of audiences, but we do not think that they changed many minds. One of them was Sarah Pellett. She is believed to be the first woman to deliver a public lecture for pay. She gave some talks in San Francisco on political equality and received some very negative reviews. One review said she was rambling and dull, and it said that the mixed audience didn't understand what she was driving at. In the late 1860s, women such as Emily Pitt Stevens started demanding that women be allowed to vote. She caused quite a scandal in San Francisco when she attended a speech by a noted anti-suffragist. She jeered from the audience and got into an argument with a state assemblyman. At one point, she pulled a derringer out of her purse and aimed it at the assemblyman, point blank. Of course, that caused a panic. No shots were fired, but she believed she made her point. Pitt Stevens bought a small Bay Area newspaper that focused on romance stories. She turned it into a suffrage newspaper. But the all-male legislature in California was in no mind to extend the vote to women. And while lawmakers ignored the issue, some women tried other avenues to improve the lot of women. Clara Foltz. Now, this was a woman who I did not know in history, but had an amazing impact on women in California. She had married a Union soldier in the mid-1860s in Indiana at the age of 15. By 1878, after moving to San Jose, Clara and her 5 children were abandoned by her husband. And she was very concerned about being able to make a living. And she wanted to go to law school, just like her brother and father. But the law prevented her from going to law school. Only white males could attend law school. So she convinced a San Jose senator to introduce a bill to allow women to become lawyers. She lobbied it through the legislature, but she had no idea if the then governor, William Irwin, would sign it, veto it, or simply have a pocket veto. Irwin hadn't tipped his hand. And as the midnight deadline approached for the signing of legislation, Clara Foltz waited outside the governor's office. And an individual came out from that office and said, "The women's lawyer bill is dead." Clara was just incensed, and she rushed into the office, getting by the security, and all of a sudden ended up being in Governor Irwin's office, where he was working on signing or vetoing legislation. And she was able to go up to him and say, "What are you doing on the women's lawyers bill?" And he asked an aide to get the bill out of the pile of bills. And he looked it over and he says, "You know, this isn't a bad bill. I'm going to sign it." And she later wrote that this measure was signed just a few seconds before midnight, the midnight deadline. Foltz was accepted to attend the newly opened Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. She was only there 3 days before she was escorted off campus, saying that Hastings, the man who had put up most of the money for the law school, did not want any females attending the school. So she and a fellow student, Laura DeForce Gordon, sued to get into Hastings. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won. Foltz is barely a footnote today, but she went on to become the first female lawyer in California, the first woman deputy district attorney in the United States, and the first woman to run for governor. She created the public defender's office in California and the concept of the parole system. Now, Steve will talk more about women's movement for suffrage, moving forward.
So the fight for women's suffrage spanned decades, and it was quite a struggle. Every time a bill was introduced in the legislature, the men in the legislature shot it down. Quote, "Women were not smart enough to vote," some said. Others said women were too pure and wholesome to get sullied by the dark arts of politics. Whatever the trumped-up reason, suffrage was denied. In 1896, though, the legislature punted the issue and put the suffrage measure on the statewide ballot at the last minute. So women had to scramble to organize and to raise as much money as they could to fund a statewide campaign. National suffrage leaders like Susan B. Anthony helped the campaign by giving speeches up and down the state. As a matter of fact, Anthony, who by then was in her 70s, gave as many as 3 speeches a day during that campaign. Primarily, the campaign was run by and for middle-class and upper-middle-class white Californians. Minorities and working women generally were not invited to participate. 250 newspapers endorsed suffrage in 1896 during that campaign, while 27 did not, and one of those against was the crusty publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Harrison Gray Otis. He accused women of being mercenaries who would sell their votes to highest bidders, and he editorialized often in the LA Times against that measure. Ultimately, the measure lost by a scant 26,000 votes. The scales were tipped by a last-minute barrage of publicity by the liquor industry. It was afraid, of course, that women who had pushed temperance for so many years would approve new laws banning the sale and use of alcohol should they get the vote. The industry flooded the bars and hotels and groceries up and down the state with warnings, especially in San Francisco, which seemed to have a tavern on every street corner, and it was the largest city in the state. The San Francisco vote during that election was 3-1 against suffrage. 14 years later, of course, 1910, Hiram Johnson and the Progressives take over in California, and they were swept into office, and although Johnson personally was against women's suffrage, he didn't stand in the way of a suffrage movement, a measure going through the legislature that would put suffrage on a special election ballot in 1911. The women faced another uphill battle, though. Once again, the LA Times led the opposition with one of the more ridiculous arguments you can ever think of. It said it does not believe in the justice or the expediency of burdening the women of California with the duty of voting. But other newspapers, including the San Francisco Call and the Sacramento Bee and others, pushed for the vote. In this B editorial cartoon, a man is saying, "Why shouldn't my mother vote?" The campaign used innovative campaign techniques to secure votes to attract male voters who wouldn't sit through a lecture, for example, or a pro-suffrage speech. They acquired a 1910 Packard touring car called the Blue Liner, very fancy for the day. They would take it out to various street corners, primarily in San Francisco and elsewhere, park it on the street, wait for the men to flock around the car to look at the fancy gadgets, and once they were there, they would pop up and give them a pro-suffrage speech. Because you got to remember, only men could vote in this election. So on posters and flyers, the campaign repeated the slogan, "Give your girl an equal chance with your boy." This time, the movement sought working class women, and to some degree minorities, to work on the campaign. And again, the liquor industry fought back. Suffragist Selena Solomons wrote the only detailed account of that election and that entire campaign. She talked about her utter despair on election night, which was a Tuesday, of course, when the vote count showed that the suffrage measure had lost. And actually all the votes hadn't been counted yet, but the headline said, "Suffrage goes down to defeat." Especially lost big in San Francisco. On Wednesday, the following day, she wrote, as votes trickled in from rural areas and from Southern California, the measure closed the gap. But it wasn't until Thursday that it became clear that suffrage would win, and it was by a very slim margin. But California did become the 6th and the largest state to give women the vote. Interesting, the first 6 states to give women the vote in the country were Western states. I mean, there's a Western spirit that was really coming into play, and they weren't basically hidebound by former dogmas that the Eastern states were concerned about. And guess what? After that election, LA, the voters in Los Angeles, put the suffrage measure over the top, despite the LA Times. The suffrage leaders had learned from their mistakes 15 years earlier. Whereas 36 counties voted against suffrage in 1896, only 8 said no in 1911. Despite the enormity of the special election ballot, which included regulation of the railroad, workplace reforms, the initiative, the referendum, and recall, and all sorts of measures, despite the enormity of that ballot, voter turnout was very light. But the campaign did turn a 26,000 vote defeat into a 3,500 vote victory. And in San Francisco, which was heavily influenced still by the liquor industry, the anti-suffrage vote was only 2-1, which was considered a major victory, and not 3-1 as it was 15 years earlier. One of the ongoing arguments against giving women the vote was that they really didn't want it. And that argument tend to resonate with a lot of the male voters. After winning the franchise, the first big test were the city elections in Los Angeles, which was December, right after the November vote. Women voted overwhelmingly to vote. They registered overwhelmingly, and 95% of those who registered actually turned out and cast ballots. An inconvenient truth during the struggle for civil rights and other reforms is that formal politics in California was mostly a white affair. Women's social and suffrage groups were made up of middle-class and wealthy whites who excluded minorities. Part of that stemmed from resentment from the post-Civil War 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the vote but didn't mention women's suffrage. Plus, there simply was some racism at work, and that forced African Americans to create their own suffrage clubs. For much of California's early history, women of color simply were concerned with issues of survival, and they didn't really have the time or the wherewithal or the desire to get involved in a number of social reforms. They just had to, as I mentioned, survive. Brigid Biddy Mason, a slave from Georgia, for example, was brought to California by her owner, her master, in the 1850s. California became a free state, but her master wouldn't give her up. And so she had to go through the courts to win her freedom, even though blacks were banned by law from testifying against whites. She worked as a midwife and a nurse in Los Angeles. She saved every penny she earned, and then she bought some real estate. She bought 2 parcels in what turned out to be downtown Los Angeles. And and she became absolutely wealthy and a philanthropist after that. In San Francisco, Mary Ellen Pleasant was a former slave who also used the courts to stand up for her rights. In the 1860s, nearly 100 years before Rosa Parks, she sued a San Francisco streetcar company for refusing to let her and other African Americans ride in their cars. With the lawsuit underway, she won her case when the company abruptly changed its policy. She owned, when she arrived in San Francisco, she started out as a cook, and then she bought a boarding house and then other boarding houses. She she saved her money. She earned a lot of money. She owned a string of laundries. She invested in mining companies, and she too became wealthy and used much of her money to find shelter and to find work for runaway slaves, even on the docks of San Francisco. Even after women were given the vote, it wasn't until 1918, exactly 100 years ago, that 4 women broke barriers and won election to the state legislature. All of them had deep ties to the community, and all of them crushed male adversaries at the ballot box, transitioning from novelties to lawmakers. And they left lasting imprints on significant public policy issues such as corrections and juvenile justice, education, social welfare, and water and energy. Grace Doris, a Bakersfield teacher, ran in place of her husband, who was sent overseas to fight in World War I. Remember, this was 1918. She took on the wealthy landowners in Kern County who owned 1 million acres in her district, and they also financed the campaign of one of her male opponents. She campaigned for shorter work hours for domestic servants and a public defender's office to provide legal services for the poor. Esther Brownton of Modesto had contracted spinal tuberculosis as a child, which stunted her growth and gave her severe curvature of the spine. She grew only to be 4 feet 6 inches. But she excelled at UC Berkeley. She became a lawyer and the Assembly's expert on water and irrigation issues. She authored landmark legislation that gave spouses the right to half of community property. Elizabeth Hughes also was a teacher, and she was from Oroville. Remember, she and others were running during World War I during World War I when we were fighting against the Germans. And her male opponent tried to play the gender card during her campaign in 1918. The weekend before the election, he placed a newspaper ad suggesting women were not tough enough to stand up to Germany. Quote, "Politics is no pink tea job," he said. To perpetuate our democracy, he said, we need men in the legislature who pack a punch and can't be bluffed. Well, Hughes replied that women everywhere, in the offices, in the factories, on the farm, and at the front with the Red Cross, were proving the mettle of American womanhood, and she won a convincing victory. Hughes focused on public education when she was in the legislature, and she was instrumental in advocating for the support and expansion of Chico State. As a former teacher and librarian, Anna Saylor of Berkeley campaigned on a platform to eradicate illiteracy by boosting state support for schools. But her greatest accomplishments helped reform the state's criminal justice system. She led a high-profile campaign to abolish the death penalty for minors, and as a matter of fact, even received death threats after introducing that legislation, which did pass. Her legislation established psychiatric clinics in state prisons, and as California's director of social welfare after she left the legislature, she reformed the state's probation system and saw to it that delinquent children, some as young as 8 years old, were not placed in the same jails as hardened criminals. What's interesting is the fact that after those 4 women were elected to the state assembly, only 10 other women were elected to the assembly or the entire legislature in the ensuing 56 years. So what seemed like a real Me Too moment, shall we say, back in 1918, was not followed up for a number of years. During the Depression, it was expected that men, as the head of the household, deserved jobs before women in politics or the general workplace. During World War II, women who wanted to work were expected to serve in the war effort in defense plants, not run for office. And in the 1950s, women were told they should stay home with the kids, taking advantage of new household conveniences. But going back well over a century, women found other ways to get involved in politics and serve their community. And I'm just going to touch on a few of them, and there are so many. Around the turn of the century, women's clubs, a driving force behind social and civic reform, decided to do something about the overlogging of California's redwoods. They brought the issue to the attention of President Theodore Roosevelt, also to the legislature, to Congress, and they organized, they lobbied, they protested, and today we have large swaths of beautiful old age redwoods along the north coast, the central coast, and the Sierra foothills that have been preserved forever. Or at least we hope they've been preserved forever. Kathryn Edson never was elected to anything, but working with the Friday Morning Club in Southern California in 1910, she investigated tainted milk in Southern California that was making infants sick. The legislature clamped regulations on the industry thanks to her efforts. After she was appointed to Hiram Johnson's new Industrial Welfare Commission, she investigated wages and working conditions among women in the canneries and elsewhere, and she was responsible for requiring businesses to give working women living wages. And then there's Leon Baxter. She never ran for office, but she helped elect governors and legislators and invented strategies and tactics to successfully influence dozens of ballot measures. In 1934, she and her future husband, Clem Whitaker, created a partnership that became the nation's, at that time, only professional political campaign management firm. And for many years, they were the only firm, for decades, they were the go-to firm and perhaps the only firm in that industry running campaigns. They gained national fame in 1934 when they ran a sophisticated and cutthroat campaign to defeat famed muckraker Upton Sinclair in his run for governor here in California. And for 3 decades, Whitaker and Baxter dominated their field, and what they created is now duplicated in every corner of the country. You can't run for dog catcher without having a campaign consultant now. In 1946 Los Angeles, Felicitas Mendez and her husband fought the Westminster School District that separated Mexican-American children from the white children and sent them to inferior schools. The Mendezes took the school district to federal court and won a landmark victory. The court decision prompted the legislature and California's Governor Earl Warren to desegregate California schools, and this was 8 years before the landmark Brown versus Board of Education school desegregation in the U.S. Supreme Court. Just as women led the effort to save the redwoods, women also kickstarted the state's campaign to reduce air pollution. And this was in the 1950s and in Los Angeles, which was choking from smog. Regulatory agencies were slow to act and the situation was deteriorating. So that's when a handful of Beverly Hills socialites with young children and ties to the entertainment industry decided to exert public pressure for action. And they started an organization called Stamp Out Smog. They held marches and rallies and publicity stunts to galvanize public opinion. And it took time, but it worked. At one event, they held a party to commemorate the 21st anniversary of LA's first official smog attack. They pressured state and local governments into action. And one Los Angeles County supervisor, Warren Dorn, gave the women credit for helping the state and local lawmakers pass 250 new measures to help reduce air pollution. More recently, March Fong broke barriers, becoming the first Asian American woman to be elected to the legislature. That was in 1966. And as you can see from that photo, she also broke a toilet on the steps of the state capitol to push her bill banning pay toilets in public spaces in the state of California. Now, I know it was well before most of your time, but back then, women had to have a bunch of dimes handy in their purses to use the public facilities. I mean, it was pretty amazing. She went on to become Secretary of State and serve many terms as Secretary of State. Same year that Fong was elected to the Assembly, another barrier was broken when Yvonne Brathwaite became the first African-American woman elected to the legislature. She went on to Congress and enjoyed a long and successful career as a supervisor in Los Angeles County. And for the record, California did not have a woman as a state senator until Roseanne Buuck in 1976. That's 126 years after statehood. Once she was in the office and sitting on the Senate floor, whenever a member stood and said, "Gentlemen of the Senate, I urge you to pass this bill," she would ring a small porcelain bell and remind them that it's gentleman and lady. and it seemed to work after a while. The Senate wasn't really prepared for her because there was no women's restroom right off the Senate floor. Well, today there is, and it's called the Rose Room in honor of Roseanne Buuck. In 1990, California voters approved term limits for legislators. One important consequence, and it was an unintended consequence, was that term limits forced entrenched male lawmakers, many of whom had spent decades in the Assembly or the Senate, they forced them out of office. And we know from our history that the easiest path for a woman or any newcomer really to win an election is in an open seat when you don't have an incumbent, because incumbents have access to money. They have greater ties in the community usually, and they have all sorts of advantages that outsiders don't have. In the years that term limits were imposed, women gained significant strength in the legislature. The numbers just went up, up, and up. But looking ahead to this year's elections, and everybody seems to think that 2018, including in California, nationally and in California, might be the so-called Year of the Woman. We have seen a record surge of women nationwide who have announced candidacies for state offices and for Congress. And this comes out of Rutgers University, their organization. They have an organization on campus there devoted to women in politics. Many of these women, of course, are motivated by the Me Too movement that began in California. Concerns that the Trump administration and the courts might reverse some of the public policy gains they have won over the years, from reproductive rights, for example, to equality in the workplace. So nationally, some are saying 2018 could be another Year of the Woman. But that sentiment has to be tempered a bit in California, and here's why. There was a recent change in that term limits law that I mentioned a few years ago. That law now allows lawmakers to serve 12 consecutive years in either the Senate or the Assembly. And because of that change, in the Assembly, 79 out of the 80 current members will not be termed out of office until 2024 or later. So there are going to be no open seats, very few open seats, I should say. There will be some, of course, if there are retirements, men are forced out because of misbehavior and job hopping, things like that. But on the natural, very few open seats. And that does not portend well for the state of California. So the reality is this, we believe, despite all the enthusiasm, we should not expect a great deal of turnover in the legislature for a number of years. And in fact, we believe the roster of women in the legislature will continue to shrink. It has been shrinking for a number of years. We think it will continue to shrink, even though there's a lot of enthusiasm among women and women's issues have come to the fore. Unless you can clear out these seats and get rid of a lot of the entrenched incumbents, it's going to be uphill. So that really is our brief thumbnail sketch of some of the highlights of the women's struggle for political equality since the gold rush.